What is this case really about? Is it really about fighting corruption? Is it really about stopping an oppressive regime? Can you tell us what's really going on here?
Well, the first thing that's going on, I believe, is that the U.S. found an opportunity and seized it to get Alex Saab and get him into South Florida. I haven't investigated the actual criminal indictment, except that to say that it's old. These facts are old. The Swiss investigated their part of it, the money, where the money went, and they didn't find anything. The U.S. takes the position that any time a country tries to do anything around the sanctions, that the U.S. should stop them, and so it tries to make the sanctions worldwide, in my view.
Right. Well, the United States argues that they're simply enforcing their sanctions against Venezuela as well as money laundering laws. Is there a legal basis for that? I mean,
If he gets indicted, that is to say, if he gets extradited, I should say, we'll have to delve into those issues. But the U.S. takes the position that anyone who manages to get past the sanctions is violating the sanctions, which makes the sanctions worldwide. And anytime money becomes dollars, and it's very difficult for money to travel through international streams without becoming a dollar. But if it becomes a dollar, the U.S. believes it has jurisdiction.
now I wanted to ask at this point, Alex Saab is saying that he was tortured in Cape Verde and that if he's extradited to the United States, he will face further torture. Is that a credible claim? Do you know the conditions of how he was detained in Cape Verde and what he could face in the United States?
I don't know what exactly were his conditions in Cape Verde. I know that in South Florida, he will probably be in solitary confinement. And if so, that in itself is torture when it lasts for more than a few days. And, we have to remember that he's a diplomat, and diplomats have immunity. And Cape Verde has ignored that. It's ignored the decision from the court for West Africa, which actually has a judge from Cape Verde on it. But whether he's not going to be strung up, he's not going to be tortured like people were in the black sites or in Guantanamo. But holding for someone for a long period of time is itself torture when that person's in solitary confinement. And right now, fortunately, he's under home confinement. It's not great, but it's much better than being in prison.
Now, a lot of international bodies seem to be following this case pretty closely. And is that because it has implications beyond just Venezuela and the United States?
Sure, it has implications for any country that's sanctioned, and there are a number of them. It has implications for the Maduro regime and the US's constant efforts to basically overthrow it. It has certainly, if a envoy, someone who has diplomatic immunity, can be captured in a country, that's a very bad precedent.
Now, Venezuelan media is portraying Alex Saab as a humanitarian, but U.S. media is quite skeptical, accusing him of being a corrupt billionaire. Can you describe who Alex Saab was before he was detained? I mean, who is he as a person?
Well, Alex Saab is a businessman, um, but and he's also close to the government and supports the government, of course, of Venezuela. And in this case, he took on the duty of getting medicine. This was right when COVID started, and Venezuela needed medicine, obviously, for its people and humanitarian goods. And this was a humanitarian trip to Iran to get what Venezuela needed.
So he was detained while.
I don't think there's any question about
So,
that. I just don't think there's any question that that's what he was doing.
so he was traveling to Iran to get medicine for Venezuela to deal with the COVID situation.
Correct, that's what he was doing. And the plane refueled in Cape Verde. Cape Verde is a frequent refueling spot for long haul distance airplanes. And somehow the US found out that he was there. It appears that it was the Cape Verde authorities had to have notified the US. I don't know how else the US found out, but we don't know that. But at this point it doesn't matter. What matters is that he should not be extradited. He should be released. That's what the African court held. That's what foreign bodies are saying. It's only the US, of course, that wants him extradited. And there's a lot about this that's a little bit slippery. When did the red notice get there? Was it that day or the day after? It certainly appears to be the day after. Why was he held if there was no Interpol red notice out for him? Um, so there are a lot of issues, but I believe the main one is that he had diplomatic immunity. Clearly, he was on a mission. There's a appropriate letter from Venezuela to Iran. There's the appropriate letter back from Iran to Venezuela, basically accepting him. That those two things have to happen. They did happen before he was arrested. There's just no question about that. This is the U.S. using the long arm of its law as it tries to do around the world.
Now, I guess I'm seeing a parallel between the situation with the chief financial officer of Huawei, who was, detained in Canada. And it sounds like this case could, in a way, be setting precedent for how the United States operates around the world. I mean, is that why it's important to you?
Well, it's important to me because I have a client who's being detained, I believe, illegally, and I'm concerned about him. And I don't want him to be extradited. And if he is, I don't want him in jail in South Florida. Um, does it set a precedent? I think it does because of the diplomatic immunity issue, which will be the first thing that we fight again if we go to South Florida. But we still have one court left in Cape Verde and the Constitutional Court, and we're still hopeful that that court will do the right thing and release him.
Okay. Now, I understand you represent at least one of the detainees in Guantanamo Bay. And I'm curious because there is talk of the Biden administration resuming some of the efforts that went on under the Obama administration to shut down Guantanamo Bay. Do you think Guantanamo Bay, could be shut down in the next 4 years?
If there's political will and political capital, willing to expend political capital, yes. There are 40 people left there. About 33 of them, I believe, have never been charged. 9 have been cleared for release. The US has cleared them. There's no reason that the Biden administration cannot set up the proper envoys and things in the State Department and get those people out first, and then get the others out. They can't argue anymore, really, that these people are being held under international law. The U.S. argues that. Everyone else disagrees. They haven't ever been charged. In the United States, when people haven't been charged, they get out. And that's all there is to it. As for the ones who've been charged, including my client, Abraham al-Nasri, who's facing the death penalty, and the 9/11 people and a couple others, they need those cases need to be resolved. They just need to be resolved in a way that's fair to them, that applies due process and follows the U.S. Constitution, which at this point is not what's happening. We need to get rid of the military commissions. They've obviously been a complete failure, having only convicted a few people, and 3 of them have already had their sentences and their cases reversed. I'm working as hard as I can, to see that that happens.
Well, why were previous administrations unable to shut down Guantanamo Bay? I mean, you'd think if the President of the United States wants Guantanamo Bay shut down, it would be shut down.
Well, it's not as easy as that. And we know that the Trump administration made no efforts. Under the Obama administration, there were efforts made. My other client, Mohamedou al-Salahi, did get out during that time. He was never charged and he was tortured. And of course, there's a movie about him now, The Mauritanian. But the Obama administration also appealed the cases, the habeas corpus cases that were won. The judge granted habeas for Mohamedou in 2010, but he was still there in 2016 because the Obama administration appealed. And at one point, when there was an act over Detroit of a Nigerian man who tried to, I believe he tried to set his underwear on fire. But he'd been trained by someone in Yemen, so Obama said none of the Yemenis are going back to Yemen. And, things like that didn't help close it. He did work at the very end to get people out, and some did, like Mohamedou, thankfully. But it takes effort, and it's a difficult problem. We, of course, should never have had the problem in the first place, but we do, and we have to resolve this. There are, men there who've been there almost 20 years now and never charged with a crime. That's just wrong.
Now, have conditions in Guantanamo Bay improved? I mean, have they changed the way people are being held? Has there been any significant changes to the facility since it was opened?
Well, the facility is falling apart. That's one problem. They had to move some people from one camp to another. Nobody's being actively tortured like they were. I don't know that anybody's even being interrogated, but just the fact of being held for so long is a form of torture. They have some classes. Mohamedou had drawing classes. He was taking Turkish from a teacher who didn't speak Turkish, and so they were kind of learning together. They have some books. So in some senses, it's better, but it's still a place that should not exist, and it has destroyed people's lives, literally destroyed their lives.
Now, has the international concern and outrage about Guantanamo Bay had an impact on the conditions there in the facility? Has that had any impact?
I don't think it's had much impact in al-Nashri's case. We already won two cases in front of the European Court of Human Rights against two countries where the CIA tortured him, and he received 100,000 euros for each one that went to his family. They're Yemeni and they live in Saudi, and they got the money. We're about to go to another country and argue the same thing. We have a case in front of the International Criminal Court. We have a case in London. So what those get for him is accountability. The rest of the world sees, and even the US to some extent, sees what happened to them um, in the black sites. And Mohamedou's book, Guantanamo Diary, and his movie tell people what happened in Guantanamo. So my hope is that this gets, particularly the movie, The Mauritanian, gets this conversation started and puts more pressure on the Biden administration to really set up the what needs to be set up in the State Department so that we can get moving. He may not have 4 years, may only have 2 years. We don't know what'll happen in the midterms.
What did go on in terms of torture? What did take place? Can you describe it for our audience?
Sure, I can tell you what happened to Mohamedou, who was the worst tortured in Guantanamo. He was denied sleep for 70 days, basically maybe giving an hour or two of sleep, and that causes your brain to get fuddled. You start to have hallucinations, which he did. He was grabbed one day, beaten. We found his medical records that his ribs were broken, taken out on a boat, waterboarded in the sense that they made him drink salt water. He was beaten. He was shackled, um, bent over, shackled. They had his medical records, the interrogators did, and they knew what they shouldn't do, and that's what they did. Bend him over. He has a long-standing back problem before Guantanamo. Um, and then they gave him a false letter telling him, this was a captain guy who called himself Captain Collins, who was really a bad Chicago cop reservist. And he brought in this letter that appeared to be from the president saying, because you won't cooperate, we're arresting your mother. And the cop said to him, I can't guarantee her safety. And I think that's what finally did it. He said, all right, I'll tell you anything you want. So he did. He told them anything they wanted. But the problem was none of it was true. And the way they did it was, well, for example, there was a tower in Toronto and you planned to blow it up, right? Yes. And that was for Al Qaeda, right? Yes. That's the way it went. And Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Couch was assigned to prosecute him. And when he found this out, he was a Marine, he said, no, we don't, we don't have any evidence here except that which you got through torture. And later, when they found out none of that was true, his situation improved. He had a bigger cell, he had a garden, but he was still in solitary confinement all those years. And he was the worst. If you read his book, watch the movie, you'll see what happened to him, and it's really horrible. I mean, it was about a year of torture.
So they were using torture to extract false confessions?
Yes, because that's always what happens with torture. It never works. Besides being immoral, it is illegal under all circumstances, even in war. And it has a history, of course, of giving false confessions. And they didn't know what they were doing. I mean, they didn't know, they just did it. And there was someone named Mr. X who just recently we've discovered who he is. Just vicious, it was human beings at their worst, frankly.
Now, is there a concern that Alex Saab, if he is taken into custody by U.S. officials, could be subject to this kind of treatment?
I don't think he would be subject to that kind of treatment in a U.S. prison. If he says, I want a lawyer, I don't want to talk to you, they're not going to talk to him. They're not going to go in and torture him because it wouldn't make any sense. They wouldn't get anything that way. And, I hope he knows that he has to say, I want a lawyer, and that's the end of it. And I don't think that would be violated. I think he's already been in prison now for quite a while. He's elderly, he's got health problems. These are not usually well treated in prison situation.
And do you see a connection between the Guantanamo Bay situation and the legal precedents that have been set there and what's going on with Alex Saab?
What I see is the U.S. going outside the rule of law in more and more ways. Guantanamo was clearly outside the rule of law, and still is. And if the U.S. is going and arresting people who it knows have immunity, arresting people, I don't know what they told Cape Verde. I don't know what Cape Verde gets out of this. But if the U.S., the U.S. has already declared that the world is a battlefield, that everywhere is a battlefield. So it uses any number of ways that anytime money becomes dollars, we get it. The world is a battlefield. Anyone we pick up anywhere. Muhammad was picked up in his home in Mauritania. Only a very few of the people in Guantanamo were actually on an active battlefield. The U.S. dropped leaflets all over Pakistan, North Pakistan, and Afghanistan saying, turn in a terrorist and you'll get $5,000. And that's where they got 85% of the people in Guantanamo. So Is it spreading? The cop from Chicago already was accused of beating up kids and torturing them to get confessions in Chicago, black kids in Chicago. And so that morphs into Guantanamo. Whenever we have a situation like this, we have to be concerned that it will find its way into the law in many different ways. Money laundering was originally, they were drug cases, and now we see it wherever the US wants to prosecute. So we really have to be careful about this. And in this case, we'll do everything we can to make the US stay within the rule of law and keep our client, if out. We want him out.
Well, I understand in Chicago, in Hoban Square, there was a black site that was set up for U.S. citizens or something to that effect, right? In Chicago, there was some kind of black site or something. Is that correct?
Well, no, I wouldn't call it a black site.
Okay.
What happened was there were a bunch of cops, and there would be a murder. And rather than really investigate it, they'd just pull some teenager in and beat him up until he admitted to it. So that has been, there are movies written about that. And there's been a big investigation of what they did.
Was this the case with Officer John Burge?
Burge was the main one, yes.
And this person who was in Guantanamo Bay was a police officer from Chicago?
Yes. Yes.
Do you see a connection there, or is this just, a random thing, or?
Oh yeah, there's a connection there. He was sent to Guantanamo and was the head interrogator. Yeah, he took Chicago to Guantanamo. And then Guantanamo went to the black sites. Guantanamo was, as many people have said, a training ground for the black sites. And the black sites were horrific. I mean, we're talking about 16th century torture, hanging people for 2 days, blindfolded, beating people, waterboarding people, putting people in small boxes. I mean, just horrific, horrific torture over a fairly long period of time. They were sodomy, basically. Rectal rehydration is nothing more than rape, because there is no such thing as rectal rehydration, and certainly not when you squirt hummus up somebody, which was done. I mean, just horrible, horrible, horrible things. And much of that is still classified because the Senate Armed Services Committee report is still classified, except for that little executive part that we know about. But even that shows for El Nasri, for example, that he was blindfolded and someone chambered a gun by his head, turned on a drill, told him his family was coming to be raped. And that's in there. Waterboarded, all those things. But the public needs to be aware of them so that it doesn't happen again. This isn't the first time the military and the CIA have done this. We know about a long history of things they've done that they should not have done, and training of police in South America. We constantly have to remind ourselves of it and do everything we can to steer the other direction.
Okay. Well, just quickly, I'll conclude by asking you, I know that there have been a number of international voices that have spoken up around the case of Alex Saab. There's some voices from the UN. Can you talk about the concerns of the international community and who has spoken up?
Well, I know that we've sent submissions to the Special Rapporteur on Torture, to the Working Committee on Human Rights, a number of UN committees, and there is a concern Um, there's a concern about particularly immunity and those issues, and the Cape Verde just ignoring everything, the courts in Cape Verde. Finally, they agreed that he had to be put into home confinement because they had waited too long to decide. But it's really the only thing that we've ever won, and the international community is extremely concerned. You know, we have another example in, wasn't it Belarus, where they took a plane down? If countries can just go outside the law, that one, of course, was really outrageous, go outside the law in these ways, nobody has any safety. No one has any safety anywhere in the world. I would expect Cape Verde. I was just going to say I would expect Cape Verde to follow the law, and I don't think that they have.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you very much.